Hello Proponomics people, and welcome to a slightly longer form Sunday supplement summary from the 14th of January 2024. So, here's what was going on this week. I got stuck into the macro data, of course. The BBA mortgage rate, which is the average rate taken as a temperature test from the big banks that mortgages drop off onto when they come out of their fixed term. So this would be primarily comprised, of course, of normal owner-occupier mortgages rather than investment and buy-to-let mortgages. But nonetheless, that fell to 7.96. Still sounds eye-wateringly high, of course, but it's down from 8.05 in October last year. So it is finally moving in the right direction. My view is it might get down to around about 7% by the end of this year. That'll still be very high. It was just over 3.5% during COVID and around about 4.5% for most of the time that preceded COVID, because obviously interest rates were very low during the COVID era. 5-year gilt traded in a pretty tight range. There was some relatively positive economic data in terms of GDP. So November was 0.3% up, but the 3-month rolling was 0.2% down. So still not looking particularly good, but it was slightly ahead of consensus forecasts. And I thought that perhaps the bonds might move, but really what's defined what they've been doing is the activities in the Red Sea. Money tends to flock into bonds as a safety feature apart from anything else whenever there's a hot war, conflict, that sort of thing, the stuff that's going on with the Houthi rebels that I'm sure you've read about in the news. So UK economy is still facing some challenges. Maybe we'll have a technical recession, maybe we won't. I don't think it really matters. Psychologically, it would be better to avoid one, but nonetheless, most of the commentators, and I also agree with them, are saying that we should have a positive quarter one of this year. I think a lot of that is driven by actually having inflation under some element of control, because sub 4% is where I see the gate, if you like. So as we're at 3.9, and we'll find out where we are this week, we're in a much safer place than we were last January, for example. And then I talked a little bit about the Bank of England Overground. So this is a blog series that the Bank of England share some of their primary research papers, the same papers that they give, or a summary, I should say, of the papers that they give to the Monetary Policy Committee and the Financial Policy Committee. And what this does is it informs us what are the bank worrying about at the moment? What are the bank checking out? Well, of course, one of the big things they're looking at is what has the interest rate increase in such a relatively short period of time done to household expenditure? Because remember, the bank's brief, apart from controlling inflation, which of course they haven't done a great job of over the past couple of years, is to ensure the financial stability of the UK economy. And it's very important that they achieve that, of course. So they're looking at things that could affect or present risks to the financial stability of the UK. And one of those, the big one really, is that C, as the economists call it, consumption goes down dramatically. So what can make consumption go down dramatically? Well, apart from anything else, the fact that so much more money has got to leave your bank account every month for interest payments on debt. And of course, a second order impact of that would be how much less tenants have got to spend if their rents had to go up, because their landlord's mortgages have gone up and it's forced their landlord into a position where they've had to put the rent up. But in this entry, specifically, the bank has concentrated on people with mortgages, and it does this via a survey that it issues once a year. Now, this is quite a good survey. It's in-depth, it's very detailed, and it looks at what people have actually done, so the actions that they've taken, and then it also looks at their intentions going forward. Now, I'm always very sceptical about surveys around intentions. In the buy-to-let sector, we've seen absolutely tons of these since Section 24, 2015, and intentions have been talked about, but they have not turned into actions, generally speaking, when it comes to large-scale disposals of property portfolios. The driver, more recently, has simply been the interest rate and the number of landlords who are still on old buy-to-let mortgages that are now tracking the base rate, and the financial and commercial reality has been forcing them out of the game rather than an annoyance at paying a level of tax. But anyway, the bank has looked at how much less will a household spend for every £100 that goes on its mortgage. And the answer to that, according to their research, is £50. They'll spend £50 less. So you start to wonder, well, where does that extra £50 come from? Is it just magicked out of thin air? No, it's going to come from savings, or it's going to come from savings that aren't made because that £50 isn't going into savings, but it's bridging the gap between what's been saved elsewhere, or people have had pay rises, or they're going to be using things like credit cards. That's ultimately where that would come from. But that's not good news. We don't want consumption to go down. It puts a further strain on the UK economy. And then I talked a little bit about Rightmove. They've made some predictions for the market in 2024. Quite strange predictions, to be honest with you. I don't know why they've really focused on these three. But the first one is about landlords and balancing priorities. So they would obviously think that rent would like to be set as high as possible, especially on new lets. Landlords tend to form relationships with their tenants, especially when they're at the smaller end, and they try and keep rents down wherever they can when a tenancy has started. But of course, at the moment, they're pushing the rents as hard as they can, even more so in Scotland, where there's been recent legislation which has tried to control the rent increases that there have been, and really, I would argue, has led to much bigger rent increases, especially on new units, and the figures and the data have borne that out, of course, as well. But they're talking about the trade-off with affordability, much more of a problem in London and the South East, less of a problem in the provinces. Completely depends where you are. There are some regional figures that you can dig into if you want to have a look at them. They also predict that people are going to delay green improvements because of the Renters Reform Bill. Now, this was the one that really left me scratching my head. I would have thought the reason for people scrapping EPC improvements is the fact that Rishi Sunak has scrapped EPC improvements. Although my personal view would be this stuff is going to happen. A sensible implementation of this is for us to go from E to D to C, and probably D by, say, 2028 or 2029 or 2030, and then C by 2035 or beyond. Going beyond C will be extremely difficult. Your average rental piece of stock, which is perhaps 100 years old, Victorian mid-terrace, is actually quite easy to get to a C, but it's really quite difficult to get it to a B unless you're using things like solar PV or other micro-generation activities, which I would argue kind of fudge things really rather than fix the problem, because they're not stopping the carbon emission, they're not making the house less leaky, but there you go. I just can't see the EPC changes and the Renters Reform Bill being related, but Rightmove thought that they should be. And then apart from anything else, they're saying that the rental market's going to stay under more pressure because affordability to buy is still stretched by higher mortgage rates. Well, that one I think is true by definition, although of course we've seen the bond yields come down over the past month or so quite significantly, so that affordability is being stretched a bit less, and it's all relative. I think it's better conditions than it was in 2023, where a lot of people would have stayed put, and let's see what happens. So the overall takeaway, of course, the economy's facing challenges. There are some positive signs, and it's worth keeping an eye on that Bank of England Overground blog. Very interesting. Thanks for listening, and if I could just ask everybody watching to like this video, subscribe and leave me a comment, that would be great. It helps out the channel an awful lot, and I'm trying to grow the channel, put more content on there, and hopefully in the future do some longer form content and interviews as well. Thank you.